But thank you, David, for joining us today for today's podcast about benefit risk assessments. I've really been looking forward to this because this is a topic that has always given me so many. It's part of my gray hairs, basically.
Yeah, mine too.
Gives me troubles, and I actually was looking at some of your other, both the articles that you are presenting on LinkedIn and also some of your slides, and I thought, this guy, he has some good ideas, so I need to talk to you.
Yeah, well, we're learning together, so because there's not a lot of good guidance for us right now in the medical device industry. So
yeah. So to the audience, I'm very happy to introduce to you David Rutledge, and it's a privilege for me to say hello to you today. And you have a CV as long as, I don't know what, it's 3 times as long as mine. So I would leave it to you to introduce yourself.
Good. Yeah, I'll do it real quickly. Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I've got a pharmacy degree, a PharmD degree, residency fellowship, had a career in academia, assistant, associate, full professor, chairman, and then worked with a large pharma manufacturer in R&D for about 7 years, and then major device company for about 13 years. Along the way, I got inducted as a fellow of the Heart Association for my research and grants that I was doing, and publications. I've got over 100 publications. I haven't published a lot academically in the last few years. I'm doing more publishing on LinkedIn, which has been a lot of fun, by the way. But along the way, I think one of the neatest things that happened to me was I had a 4-year appointment with the Health and Human Services at the FDA on a device panel group, and it was a 4-year appointment. And learned a lot. It was we'll call it an industry representative, preparing for panels. And I got to be there during the discussions. I got to see things that went on the backside of things with the agency, and then the day of the panel and things like that. So that's a quick introduction, and that wasn't so long. And this idea of so first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me. This has been wonderful, and I think you and I and others listening on your podcast are going to try to figure this out together. I don't have it figured out. I'm sort of attempting to try to put a framework together as I've done this, and I've written some of these benefit risk statements over the past few years. I'll show you kind of how it would. I'll tell you. We'll talk a little bit about how did it get started for David. But before I did that, I had a couple of things I wanted to tell you. I wanted to say, you're doing a great job with your podcast, and you've got like 10 of them so far, right? I mean, yeah, one coming up tomorrow that I'll be listening to. I saw the early preview on LinkedIn yesterday. Teaser, yeah. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
Micro
Yes, right, exactly. Yeah, that's right. When's the last time we used the word micro content? That's the stuff that you and I are learning how to do. But one of the I don't want to point out a lot of the stuff with the 10 that you did, but I did want to say genuinely that I needed to be educated more on human factors and usability. And that podcast that you did, especially the notes, I mean, you provide this service, which is phenomenal with these notes. And it's almost like a paper that you can use as a reference, which on that one I do, because I refer to the strict wordings around that because it's such a complicated area. To me, it was. Yeah. And so your notes were so superb, and it's a neat service, and you're really providing a really good educational platform for people to tap into, because there's a lot of focus on regulations in the device world all over the world with regulators, and especially in Europe right now. It's a lot of focus and rethinking and things like that. Yeah, so we'll get into this. The problem, and I sort of said, here's the problem. One of the problem statements that essentially manufacturers have not emphasized the benefits part of this benefit risk analysis for many, many, many years, and it's just been recently that there's been a focus on this, and we're learning. We don't even really have a device guidance on this. I mean, the FDA. There's been some books. I'll show this on when we get into the slides in a few minutes about what I've used to tap into to help formulate my thinking, in addition to people like you and others who help with that discussion to try to figure this out. So as we haven't focused on it, it's being focused on right now. We got the risk piece down pretty well. We've been doing that since the 80s, right? So the benefits piece is the big one. So especially as it relates to intended use of the product. So let me go to my slides, and let me
let's look at your slides.
Yeah, let's share right there. And then I was going to say, let's do screen one. Let's make sure. So tell me if you can see my screen, and I'll. And your followers in your podcast will get these slides and other materials that you and I can put to try to empower people on this. So to begin with, I would just wanted to say this benefit risk situation. I just want to acknowledge it's difficult, and it takes a lot of gray matter. And there's a whole host of things that I've looked at, things that I've listened to, other things that I've read. I mean, but I'll start with this. In December of 2019, the ISO 14971 was published. There'll be a training document that'll come out later in 2020, later this year. And though those two documents would really be helpful for us, because it really brings to light not only the risk information that we're all familiar with, but also the benefits piece of it also. And then I put a couple of guidance documents. There were more guidance documents. There were draft guidance and previous guidance that the FDA had put out. These are the updated versions of those. So for your followers on your expert podcast. And so I pulled information from the ISO 14971, from these two guidance documents, which are really helpful. And then there's this phenomenal textbook. If you don't have it, I mean, I don't get any money from this, but it's a really good, useful resource. Yeah. And Bajan has he offers training courses in this too. Your listeners probably seen him at different meetings that you and I attend. This is also what's going on, and I really would recommend this. You can get it off of Amazon. I wrote a great book review on this because I felt it touched me so much that I wanted to put something in positive. The picture over on the other side is this energy equals the speed of light squared times mass. Now I just put that up there, the E mc squared, because that's a difficult equation, but it's solvable. And what you and I are working on, and others are working on, benefit risk analysis. People say ratios, benefit risk, but it's not. The equation is what I call unsolvable, because the denominators are different with both sides of the formula, from the benefit sides and from the risk sides. And so as of today, it's not really a solvable mathematical equation that we can easily plug into. So when I wrote that LinkedIn article, I called it the unsolvable equation to highlight that. Yeah. One of the things that I felt like your listeners should know is that there's a lot of difficult things, and we'll talk about several of those today in this area. One is getting the right people involved when you're having these discussions to agree upon what you think the benefits of the product are versus the risks of the product. And I've listed sort of categories of people within our manufacturers that should get together and have a discussion, because it does. So the message here is, don't try to, as Jay did in my article, go back to your desk and do this on your own and quiet space with your coffee or tea or water, because you need input from others here, because you'll need to get an agreement on what you're trying to communicate outward from the organization. And it's a very difficult gray matter activity. So get these people together and have these difficult, tough discussions. And this could take hours to get together and agree on this. I did want to highlight in this slide here, on slide 4, what some of the language is around benefits. I'm not going to read this, but your listeners can and viewers can look at what the discussions have been around the positive impact on the patient, on healthcare professional, on public health, and what sort of parameters to look at. And if you think about these A through E on the side over here, and then what your device would look like in this setting, and what you're measuring from a clinical outcome, and what the numerators and denominators of those outcomes would be, as an example, then you begin to see how difficult this is from that perspective, because our risk values typically are not in, they're not in those identical. There's maybe some overlap, but not identical. Units of measurement, as an example. And I'll put down at the bottom of the screen, we need, you need to look at all the data. So this is not the time of piecemealing things out. You need to put it all out there, because regulatory bodies and notified bodies are going to want to see all of this together. This is a neat slide, because the next two kind of sections here deal with getting the group together and then having discussions. And you can use this as an add to it too, or take away, depending on what your device is. But go through these 12 points and have the discussion, and have some note takers writing some things down as you try to address, this in terms of the benefits. And this slide is for leading that discussion, basically. And so you can read through this, and I won't look at this. I won't review this for your listeners right now. The easiest thing maybe is this probability of death, because that's an easy one to measure, and you can get some numbers around that. But other than that one, these are pretty difficult to do. So this is sort of like when you're in your room or on the conference call, have your discussions around this, and then take 7 of these broad categories and use this as your framework, to have that agreed upon discussion about what the benefits are. And I've listed 1 through 7 here. The key here would also be to make sure that if you're making any assumptions here with what you're doing, with each of these factors that you're looking at, and kind of building your benefit side of the equation here, put those in there too, because regulators are going to want to see, and reviewers are going to want to see what assumptions you're making here, and be transparent, open, and honest, because it's not so much that, and they'll challenge your assumptions, but it's not so much that they want to challenge. They just need to know what they are, because the industry's trying to figure this out too. Our friends and the regulators all over the world are trying to learn this also. And then the last piece in this category of that side of the equation is there's uncertainties in what your potential benefits would be, whether they're, confidence intervals or that are wide, or whether there was missing data in some of your clinical investigations, on and on, as it's talked about here. And what kind of accuracy and precision do you have, where your outcomes independently adjudicated, and things like this, or who did the adjudications. So those are all in the areas of some of the potential uncertainties in the benefits, and so address these in that section also. Because again, it's not like the regulators and reviewers are going to want to grade this area per se, but they need to know what data are you using to come up with this benefits piece of the equation. And then this is a useful chart, and I have examples that we can share, and I'll just briefly maybe tap through those real quickly at the end, just to show you how I did this out for about 3 different products, and you can see how I've done this. But then, have your scribe or yourself or someone or some SMEs fill this out. Once you've agreed upon what you want to communicate outside the organization, put it into these boxes. You don't have to put it in the boxes, but I found it was helpful for me to put high-level statements here, references to what I'm going to refer to, because we have to get away from, we believe it's going to do this. It needs to be, evidence-based decision making here, and so you want to make sure you're keeping track of the evidence for each of these 7 boxes, or seven areas right here. And then you basically go through the same thing for the risk side, and this is going to be relatively easy, except because there's not going to be some things that we're not familiar with here. It's just we're going to make it a little bit more complicated because there's a focus also, like there's always been, on risk, but people reviewing risk are a lot more mature and have seasoned and have more expertise in this area. So they're expecting the bar is a little bit higher here. It's not like they're trying to figure this out. No, they've got this figured out since the 80s and have learned along the way. And we've got standards around this that have gone through the years and guidance documents. So again, I won't highlight this and won't read from this per se, but I did want to say that the purpose of this slide is to make sure that you're, in the end, you're focusing on residual risk, because that's what you're going to use to do your analysis with your benefits, as an example. And the only point I would want to try to bring out is number 5 here, because one of the things that's happened over the last few years, it's been fascinating, has been making sure when you're talking about risk assessment, you're talking about your product risk, your clinical risk, software risk, and cybersecurity risk, and then making a statement overall about the overall risk of your product from those 4 lenses, as you're looking at the product. Because we're really good about siloing out our activities. What's the software risk? We have guidance here. So what's the software risk? What's the clinical risk? There are documents out there to help us think about clinical risk. And then, the FMEAs and stuff with product risk and other things. And cybersecurity, really, really good. But we got to put this together as manufacturers and then make a conclusion overall about that. So I wanted to highlight that one because that's a tough one. That's that little bit more sophistication that's being expected of us right now. And then, unlike the 7, here's 6 kind of frameworks or platforms to, after you have your big discussion, try to put it into these 6 categories. You can add more, you can use less. I put 6 up here because these are commonly talked about in forums like this. And you can see how quickly this becomes very difficult, because your robust and rich discussion and benefits, it's a little bit different from over here, because it's so much more complicated, so much more people are bringing to this discussion, and so much certainty about this piece of the equation versus the previous piece, that the discussions are like 2 different classes in a university, because one is sort of an introductory to a topic that we want to know more about, and this is like seasoned graduate level discussions that are happening on this side of the equation. I did put on here on the bottom right hand side that but the ISO 14971 talks about controls that are in place. So make sure that your discussions here do talk about the controls that you put in your process in terms of inherent safe design and protective measures, and then information and communications that you got going out there. And then again, you got your uncertainties to address here. And I won't read this, but there's a lot of uncertainties that could exist. Standards that may not have been followed that need to be followed now in terms of itch testing, clinical data that was coming in that's risk related, and things like this. And so this sort of takes the same format as the benefits one. And then here's that little little chart that has 6 boxes. Again, you're not required to use this, but I found it for me, it was helpful to get my thinking pretty solid in these 6 categories here, and then make sure I'm referencing everything, because we want to get away from we believe statements to here's the facts, kind of thing. And then the fun at the very end, the last slide, is just like tell the story and put it all together. And this is there's no quick fix here. This is a very very difficult piece of this process, and I call it gray matter activity, trying to put this together. And I'd try to say, don't put a lot of pressure on yourself. Try to approach this by saying, as I say, make it evidence-based and be specific, and you can get some external confirmation about what you're saying here from people that your reviewers and regulators would value their opinions on. But this could be also fun. And I would say, look, think about in terms of maybe putting a half a page or a page together. It'll be more than that eventually. But don't put a lot of pressure thinking that you're going to have to write, information here, because we're trying to figure this out right now. We need more guidance in the medical device industry right now as it relates to this, and more discussions and trainings, forums, and things and strategies around this. Just say, look, I just want to put a half page together or a page together, and then just get started doing that, and you'll find out. It's going to be a fun activity because of all the hard work you did previously with those hard discussions, focusing in on those 7 or 6 elements, as an example, and then trying to put it all together, here. And like I said, don't think of this as a solvable equation, because it's not as simple as solving equations like that you and I, are used to looking at. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of what I wanted to go through with your listeners, to sort of set the platform for discussion, and then maybe I can give this back to you perhaps, and
yes,
and then we can go through maybe some discussions here.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
We jump from the slides. I think this was a perfect review. Yeah. I like the way that you put it into. Put it into very nice boxes, because even today I had a client calling, and this person was frustrated because it's we have a tendency to actually do this process automatically, but without really thinking back to the actually data that we have. And that's why I've always been thinking that this benefit risk was kind of a fluffy statement. And I was wondering, there must be a meaning behind it, right? That was why they asked us to do it. So are we fighting these fluffy things? So I'm so happy that I met you, David.
Yeah. And me too. And like I said, I really do want to say I don't have this figured out. I'm struggling with you and your colleagues and others here, but we'll learn along the way and get other people's input to try to make this a little bit better. But it does give you the framework platform to kind of put this together. I have down here a little statement that says, when you're preparing for these benefit to risk discussions, I say it's like laughing with your children or your family or your friends. You never have enough time. So, it's going to be consuming here, but just get started. Don't put a lot of pressure on yourself. You use this framework to begin writing a half a page. Yeah. And then you'll be good at that.
Yeah. So let's try and move into some of the questions that we prepared today. So we were talking about, how and when did you actually start to get into this? When did it begin for you, this benefit to risk ratio?
Yeah, I think you and I and others on your podcast can relate to this. It's for me, it's what I was thinking about. How did this all start? And for me, it was like back in 2016 when the quality management system ISO 1345 was published, and that when we were all scurrying around trying to do our gap assessment and things like this, and we were noticing in that standard or in that ISO guidance that that there was a lot of emphasis on a risk management approach to Qmed. That's now in writing. We've heard regulators talk about that. But now it was like in writing. How are you going to do? Show us how you do that. That kind of thing. And then there was also a section on product realization in 1345 about making sure that you're developing a risk management system, identify all your hazards, which we're all used to. But then it also started saying, emphasize the controls that you have in place. And that's back, remember a few years in 2016, we were talking about, what are the controls? It was all about controls, and is this a control or not, and those kind of useful discussions. And then about focusing in on FMEs, A's, and which types should we do? Design, FMEA, software, process, use, misuse, and things like that. And then there's this discussion about, these are isolated analysis. They're not really, integrated analysis, right? There are fault modes, right? So they're not like, performance based. They're really fault mode based, and just a lack of a fault doesn't necessarily mean good performance, from that clinical perspective. So in 2016, I mean, that's kind of how it all started. And then we got the, later that summer, we got the MedDev 271 Rev 4. And, that was immediately effective. There was no grace period. We were all putting together, to try to get that together. And in that, what we did is making sure our risk files got up to date. So when we submitted, any kind of a clinical report from a study or a clinical evaluation report, we had a current, risk management file. And there was talks during that time in that guidance about making sure that you've got all sizes, all model sizes and device variants. There was making sure you're talking about all the data that you have available in your company. Hey, what are the qualifications of those doing these assessments and analyses, including risk and benefit analysis and lifetime, life cycle things. And then they were bubbling up. What's your how are you defining your safety and performance claims and objective criteria around that? That's kind of where it was beginning. It really took a focus as we got toward the MDR, right? And how are your benefits satisfying these performance objectives? I mean, when's the last time we ever asked that question, kind of thing, right? Then we had to do these clinical gap assessments and things, and where's that in our technical documentation, And we were finding a lot of lack. We could find files talking about what the intended purpose of this product is going to be, but we couldn't find a lot of evidence around what's the intended benefit.
No.
And saying, it's obviously it's going to be a benefit, but we have to get away from these we believe statements, right? Mm-hmm. In 2017, we had the EU MDR was published and was really continuing those discussions with the MedDev 274. It was beginning to reemphasize the benefit side of the equation. We got lots of feedback from regulators and notified bodies about that piece of it. Those little 4 or 5 sentences we put in all of our reports about.
Yeah.
Sentences, it's obvious the benefit outweighs the risk. That kind of stuff. They wanted more facts around that. And then we got some good definitions about benefit risk in the MDR, and then more discussions about reasonable, foreseeable misuse, and then is that affecting your benefit risk analysis and stuff. And you and I hadn't thought about stuff like that before, right? But in 2017, that's when we started those discussions. And then I go back to December 2019 when the 14971 risk document for devices was published, and it gives great definitions of benefit, which I showed a few minutes ago. It aligns with the EU MDR. And the other thing it did real well was there are other standards that are out there for software biocompatibility, electrical, transcutaneous pressures, and alarms that try to tie things around. And I did a real good job of helping people to see these are not independent analyses, put it all together kind of stuff. So I think that, that was sort of my journey and the process for me is kind of how it started. It evolved over time, and it's still evolving, right? And a person after this presentation today and discussions with you'll make me better, and I'll understand differently from a different perspective, and taking advantage of your perspective here. Yeah. I need to start with you.
Maybe. So, but it's funny to actually realize sometimes that the writing from the authorities and these guidelines actually triggers thought processes. It changes our behaviors, our routines. And all of a sudden you see these new words and they're put together, and I said, maybe maybe that we should do this. Maybe it gives more sense if we start get away from the silos, make sure that we are able to pull the dots together and give a real benefit risk assessment based on actually data. That it makes perfect sense, actually.
Yeah. And it's glad that we're doing this too, and it's a behavioral change for everyone, really, right? And it's difficult, but it's the best thing for patients, healthcare providers, patient advocacy groups, and it's a win-win-win. This kind of thinking, being better at understanding that benefit to risk analysis, for especially being able to make sure that patients understand that, as an example too. So,
What what would a typical process be for you is starting up and implementing basically the outcome, because there's a result, right? So the walking through this, we talked about it needs to be a multidisciplinary team. You need to structure it, and then there is the outcome. What does it mean? So can you try and walk through how you would do that?
Yeah. So here, let me just tell you a little bit about my experience, because when we were challenged to do a better job at benefit and risk, we wanted to see what do we have on file, what's in our technical documentation. We can look through our CERs and other things, but when you went back to your product development files and design history files and things like that, so I think where did it start for me? It really was trying to do a gap assessment within our technical documentation to see what do we have available there. What's the evidence that we already have. A lot of even the things we found were, first of all, sometimes it was difficult to find documents that had anything to say about benefits, right? And then if there was any data or evidence, it was really soft data, like not really a hypothesis testing kind of results. Market analysis of something and things, or someone's opinion on it from a platform, or a statement that was made in a publication. Oh yeah, that's us, but it wasn't the level of evidence that needed to be there. So doing that gap analysis was how it started for me to understand what's the data we have on file about that. The next was, what are we communicating externally to people? Look at your website and look at your manuals maybe that you have out there for people to access, and what are the statements you're saying around that? Your promotional materials, the training materials that's out there for either patients or healthcare practitioners, investigators, and things like this. What are we saying? So doing a review of those promotional materials was really good, and trying to take a list and create a list of the claims we're trying to make on the product. Because every claim is going to be a benefit. Essentially, it's how a regulator would look at that. And then what's the evidence that we have behind that? And then I remember, just from my perspective, once we looked at what we had on file, what are we saying about the thing publicly? Then we need to do something with these clinical evaluation reports and risk files, and if your product is in clinical trials, your protocols, informed consents, and kind of quickly redo these, because there's some inconsistencies here between all these documents here. So that's it led gap assessment, promotion materials, timeout. We need to update, make sure there's consistencies in some of these important documents. Meeting with the regulators and the notified bodies, because if we need to update the IFU or any kind of promotional materials, there's a thought out there that it's good to be able to not just wait to a surveillance audit of some sort, but really be proactive and meet with your major regulators and your notified body, and then start updating your technical documentation. And I have a slide, or we'll talk about that. We have a question about that in a few minutes, but it could be, it's a lot more than just your CERs and risk files that are impacted, but then you got to put together a plan to kind of update all your technical documentation to make sure there's consistencies and things now. So it's not an easy task. It's the process. You sort of stumbled into your old files, and then you discovered where the gaps are, and then you look at, well, what are we talking about out there? We have these gaps. What are we communicating? And then you learn that there's probably opportunities to fill in gaps to really get evidence to support this, rather than someone's opinion from a platform, that you have quoted on a website somewhere. Stuff.
Yeah. So what is the hardest part of this process of risk assessment?
Yeah. So you got the framework now to talk about this, right? So that's going to be easy. And you got a platform to have the discussion. But the hardest piece, I would say there's two. One is that, maybe that slide, to get the right people in the room. It's very difficult to do a really good benefit risk analysis with limited people involved, because it's not as mature and robust as it needs to be on this side. And how many times you and I and your listeners have received that email? I can't have received that email. I can't make the meeting, but here's my report. like, 100 pages.
Doesn't
It's
work.
like, I need you to come put this into context because that report probably is not complete, and there's some missing stuff that you'll hear from these other people, and we need to wrestle with this data together and come to an agreement, or what we're going to agree on are going to be the residual risks and in the context of how our device is performing. So I think that is the piece that is difficult. And the second one is the fun part about putting this all together with all these discussions from the benefit and risk and writing that half page, 1 page, 2 page summary of your benefit to risk analysis based, and making sure it's evidence-based discussions, not we believe, discussions, but evidence-based. So I think those are the two pieces that I would say are the hardest to do. Making sure you've got commitment to get in the room or on the conference call together to have these difficult discussions. You're not going to knock this out in 30 minutes. It's going to take more than one conference call. And get in a wrestle with this and get in an agreement and alignment with what you want to, with what you're going to say going forward, and then putting together the pieces around that to get the evidence to support it.
And how do I think you're right, and I actually also find the next question is how does this assessment actually link to the clinical evaluation and the clinical investigation? I think one of the I often see that companies have full control of what investigation do they want to do, but they haven't started out this benefit risk ratio. They need to write something to the ethics committee, and they put 10 sentences together. So if you do this properly, you put the people in the room, you get to wrestle, and how would that influence actually? What would you gain from that very huge monster doing a clinical investigation?
So I would say, let me put, this is the slide I wanted to show. Let me throw this up there real quickly and just say that I think our thinking needs to be when we're talking about benefit risk, and remember that I kind of hinted at that with where do you start? Find out what's in the technical documentation, because in the very beginning, when you're talking about the intended use of the product, there needs to be a parallel path discussion with those people and others about the intended benefit of this product. And what's the evidence around this? And things. So that starts at the very, very, very beginning, way before you decide you need to do a clinical investigation, right? So one of the messages here is make sure that that going forward in our product development teams that we're having these discussions early on, and as whenever we're talking about intended use, instead of just copying and pasting from another document. Now get people together and have these discussions about intended benefit. So on the left-hand side of this slide, can you see my screen? About So I put together 17 either plans, reports, or documents that are affected here. And I published this in a LinkedIn post in March or something like that, 2020. But on the left-hand side, look at this. There are 8 different either strategies or plans that we need to wrestle with and get some language around this, all the way from your strategy for regulatory compliance, your risk management plan. We're familiar with your clinical development strategy, and this is this statement comes from if you have a Class 3 device or a Class 2B device that's active, that's delivering or extracting medicinal products from the individual. There's what's your strategy around those documents, around those products. Your clinical evaluation plan, your clinical development plan in terms of your protocol, if you're wanting to, in terms of your overall, what's your plan from first in man to approval trials to post-approval trials? What's your clinical, and that, by the way, the clinical development plan is new, right? That's a new requirement in our clinical evaluation plan, from the MDR. Then what's your clinical investigation plan? You and I have lived in that world for a long time, but the emphasis is going to be now also on, what's the benefit to the patient, and you'll see in one of the questions coming up is, do patients really know what the benefits are, and what the risks are, because they're the ones taking risks, right? There's monitoring devices that are out there that there's relatively minimal risk in some of these things. But I guess the point would be is are patients aware of the risk, and are they aware of the benefits, and how did you go about making them aware of that? And then there's the post-market surveillance plan, overall plan, and then there's that specific post-market clinical follow-up plan. So, I mean, look at all this planning that's out there that we have to do to make sure that there's benefits and risk discussions occurring there. And what's your strategy around that? And if you flip to the right-hand side, there's 9 additional reports and documents, and I won't read these, but you can, we're familiar with a bunch of the stuff at the top, but we have some new reports in the PSURs, the PMS report for Class 1 devices, the SSCPs for those Class 3 and implantable devices, and then these last 2 at the bottom down there. There's lots of documents around the labeling piece of our business, and then there's a lot of documents around the claims we're making about the claims need to be in our clinical evaluation supported by evidence and stuff. But then there are standalone documents that are being distributed externally, from the company, that we need to make sure that there's accurate and consistent information in those documents. So if you were to say, how is this impacting my quality system? Look, this is huge in terms of how it's impacting the quality system in terms of the energy that's expected, the plans that are expected, the reports that are expected, and the documents that need to be updated that you're using in your business, that are being communicated out, from 1345. So 1345 talks about, what are you communicating out from your organization, in terms of whether it's training or official communications out from your organization, especially as it relates to benefits and risk, to people. So that's to that question about other processes. It's a very simple question, but robust in terms of the answer, and all includes the expectations, since that manufacturers have figured us all out and have connected the dots. They got the triggers appropriately identified within the quality system, and there's a living system going on, and there's communications back and forth with all the processes throughout the manufacturing process, from early development to post approval. But I think we still have a lot to learn to try to make sure we've got the right triggers there. So if focused on these 17 triggers and making sure that your processes that discuss this are being referenced each way, and then the data that's coming into the organization and going out is feeding back and forth as a living system into these processes and plans and reports, then you'll be well on your way to meeting, I think, the new expectation. It's not a small task. It's difficult, but get started, and if you can't start with all 17, pick out the top 8 or 9. Try to get that solid, and then move to a phase 2 where you're looking at a little bit more integration of these processes and triggers, in your quality system. Yeah.
But I also think maybe that this central process of actually doing the benefit risk assessment could influence or could benefit if you have a proper discussion early on. For instance, the outcome could influence the clinical investigation plan. What is the actually level of evidence that we need to go out and collect? I'm curious to hear your opinion about that. If that could actually, depending on that benefit risk assessment, could we actually get it? It's so easy to say, we need an RCT and we need to do this and this. But if you actually do proper work on your benefit and risk, could you maybe then downsize because your claims, it gets clearer what data you actually have available already, or can pick up from surveys or registers or internal tests.
Yeah, and this is something I presented at RAPS in 2017. If your camera, you see this little chart behind me here. Yeah. This is a quality system trigger analysis chart that I really had a lot of fun putting this together, making sure that all the major processes, and it's really MDR related. I mean, it can relate throughout the world, but that was how I put this together. And then if you're writing a clinical evaluation plan, what should that feed into in terms of the stuff that's on the top of the bar, and the same thing that's on the top of the bar is on the side. And it was really trying to get discussions about, okay, if our plan is feeding into the clinical evaluation report, what about the stuff we find in the report? Should that feed back into the plan? And the answer is yes. And so as you go through this, 40-something processes within the clinical, within our quality system, you're going to find out, if you look at this from a process standpoint or from a data coming in and out of the organization perspective, this is a huge beast that's living, breathing, and adjusting on a daily basis. And that's how our thought process needs to be today in our medical device industry, to think of these quality systems processes, which includes clinical investigations, as an example, and others, how this activity is feeding back into your system and how it can influence, our official stance on, the performance of the device as intended from a safety and performance perspective. Again, it's it's a real complicated. If you look at it, and I'm so proud to put this together. It took me days, and I went, and those aren't available all over. I went to a printing shop and had them make me a poster, and I put it up, and I was so proud of it because. Yeah. And right now I use it sort of as a inspiration because it helps me. It reminds me about how our thinking needs to be living thinking and processes, and it's not static. So even on some reports, those are living documents back and forth, and we need to be thinking about that in those terms. But we're getting back to your perspective. In 2017 in Washington, D.C., I presented this slide that talked about how do you collect data to fill in some of these gaps, as we have. And, there were surveys and network hospital databases, investigator-sponsored studies, national registries, small clinical investigations that the company's doing, larger clinical investigations, either registries or RCTs, as an example. And then I put some money values. 1 M equals three zeros from a dollar standpoint. So it doesn't mean million, it means 3 zeros. And so you can see from the least costly to most expensive, from going from left to right. And then you could look at that. It also tracks in terms of, maybe I would say, the quality of the evidence, as an example. And when I show this slide, I always remember discussions that I've had in the past where budget managers are looking at, okay, then let's do everything medical devices and things, and that's the evidence level for. We need to take a risk-based approach here, and the higher risk device, you need more levels of evidence here. And I would say it's not just one. Maybe you'll use multiple of these strategies in your plan to try to get the evidence that you need. So it didn't always have to be clinical investigations, and I would say probably, there's a lot. Most of the products that are out there on the market won't be used in clinical investigations. The higher risk the product is, you'll see that being done more. But there's a lot of room to have, hypothesis testing information out there, and this is in the background of, we want to make sure that that we're valuing the privacy laws, the local and international and national privacy laws. That we're valuing the good clinical practice, the GCPs, either laws or guidances in the countries that we're dealing with, and that we're following the correct safety reporting. So this is in the background to make sure that we're doing all that in the background. But these are 6 options that we have moving forward here. And I would call this, I always refer refer to this, Helen, as the long pole in the tent. This is going to take a while to get this data out there, and yeah. So does this address what you were talking about? So maybe some options there.
Yeah, it does, because I think there is a tendency to put, if you take the decision that you have some data and there's some evidence that you need to go into a full clinical investigation to do that, you have a tendency to put everything into that investigation, and then all of a sudden it becomes very complicated and huge. And as you say, that use the different options to support your benefit, your claims, and then really try to also benefit from a market and business perspective in getting access to many different stakeholders and different methods. So that's why I was thinking that you have sometimes it doesn't really require an investigation. Maybe you can register surveys for some points, but for really key performance and safety parameters, then you do your study on that, but keep it simple so it doesn't really blow you away.
Absolutely correct. And I think, I remember how sober I was when was challenged by a regulator. Your product's been on the market for so long, and you're saying that your complaints, are because your complaints are low, your product is working well, but those complaints are, failure mode kind of inputs back to the organization. They're not really, performance related, and so so basically was it's since your product's been on the market so long, why are there gaps here in your benefits? And I just remember that moment where I was like sober and thinking, wow, if that's what if that's your perspective today, then we need to really plan together to get this. And it would take multiple of these strategies. So let's say you have one of your products is in a clinical investigation, and you're going to have, let's say, for example, we didn't think about accessories that are having to be used in the procedure and how that things. Well, that's not going to be in your EDC platform, and you haven't collected that in your electronic data capture. So how do you go back and do that? Do you go back and do some hypothesis testing, really good surveys where you got sample size calculations and things? You go back to large hospital networks and try to glean some information that connects procedural activities with billing, so that if there were things that went south in a procedure, you've got that connected to what was ordered, so you can tell the story of that patient internally with the electronic data system of these hospitals. Not all hospitals are linked like that, right? But those that are can really be helpful to try to gather this kind of information. Happened during the procedure with these accessories, and what was the outcome, and things like that. So so just so that you're right on, you're spot on. Take a risk-based approach and use multiple strategies to try to get this.
Exactly.
Our regulators are really expecting us to have this, and it's sobering when you're face to face with either an inspector or an auditor.
You realize
the market. What's the problem? You don't have this data, and then it's like, oh my goodness, no.
Yeah. So going back to the benefit risk assessment, do you have any examples of really tricky, difficult devices, medical devices to perform this on?
Yeah, and I really want to give some examples to. So the sort of the question is, what's the most challenging? Well, what's the most challenging ones that to do? And so let me flip it around and say the easiest ones to do are those devices that are really life-saving devices, because a lot of clinical data is existing, either required by a competent authority or the healthcare practitioners are wanting to on their own understand the performance of these life-saving devices. So the easiest ones to do are those life-saving devices products, because there's typically a lot of clinical investigations, clinical registries, around that. Now, with that said, the MDR has upclassified external defibrillators from class B to class 3, right? And yet, if you look at what's the data, the clinical data that's out there for external defibrillators, there's an example of a life-saving device where we don't have a lot of readily available clinical data on this. There's processes out there. We just need to tap into them and capture this information and provide it into reports. So those are the easiest ones. The hardest ones are those low risk devices, and I would say from a European perspective, those class 1 devices. I'll lump all the class 1s together. They're those that require notified body and not, and then those class 2A devices that are lower risk. We've typically neglected that. Maybe on this slide here, you can use what's on the left-hand side to try to tap into that and try to get some more data around those lower risk devices. So those are the hardest because you're not differentiating those in the marketplace to state of the art. They're more alike than they're different. They're more similar than they're different. In those areas, and the benefit risk analysis are a lot more challenging from that perspective. And so that's the first category of what's hard. The second category are the rest of the devices that don't have the evidence yet. And as of today, that's like everything else. Those are the ones that are difficult too, because if you don't have the data, you can't do these analyses because we're long past the days of saying we believe. People are looking and wanting to see the evidence. So what's the hardest ones? Those are those lower risk devices. But then the second hardest are those devices where data doesn't exist, because you can't make a benefit statement if there's based upon evidence when there's no evidence. Little evidence or no evidence, or the evidence is not state of the art evidence anymore. Yeah.
No, I completely agree. That also in my experience, it's always the kind of the understanding or the interpretation that the low risk class products are the easiest. But now with the MDR, and you have to provide evidence.
Yes.
It's quite difficult because no one wants to test it. No one's are collecting data on it, and you still have to find the evidence, right? So, but it should be possible. So
and on the positive note, Helen, you and your followers on this excellent podcast series, this is a great opportunity for your followers and others to think about developing an expertise in this area, right? Because we desperately need that. We desperately need people who have an expert. No matter what class of device, help me to figure this out, because we don't have it all figured out. The regulators don't have it all figured out. Our healthcare practitioners don't yet have it all figured out. Our commercial organization doesn't have it all figured out, because they can't just make these statements anymore. These statements have to be based upon facts now. As an example. And and I wanted to have a closing thought about with this, and just say, it's okay, because we're taking this as a living perspective here in our benefit to risk analysis. It's okay to say, we initially thought this, but now that we got the data, which maybe led us to do other things too, because we had other questions. Data leads to data leads to data. How these analyses go in clinical trials. We initially thought this, and now we know that that's not true, and we know this now about the product. So please, your followers and listeners need to have a perspective of comfort to know it's okay to say we were wrong. Because when we got the evidence, it wasn't really consistent with what we thought. That's okay, and that's what the expectation is. Is that you're getting the data to make these evidence-based decisions.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent final note on a great presentation. Thank you very much, David. It's been super interesting. I really enjoyed it. It's been very learningful experience and good feedback. And I know the listener will love this. So, so I want to thank you very much. Do you have any additional statements here at the end, or should we call it a day?
No,
It's
you
no
know,
more.
I've always, said that, I want to always be known for saying that podcasts like yours are key to us figuring out these tough topics. And you've addressed Qmed, you've addressed all these important distributor issues that we're dealing with in your podcast, and keep it up. And I just want to encourage you to stay the course and keep your fingers on the pulse of what the industry is doing, because it's we need it, Helen. We need it, Helen. So
thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I have so much fun doing this. I really enjoy having time. It's a kind use reserved time to speak with people. I constantly am on the phone every day, and it's short and sharp, but here we allow ourselves to have time, even though the young people say keep it short, Helen. I appreciate we took an hour to discuss benefit risk assessment. So thank you very much, David.
You're welcome.
Have a wonderful day, and speak to you another day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.